Okay, good evening to everyone who is in Australian Eastern Daylight Time, and also a more general hello to those of you who are in different time zones. Welcome to this panel discussion on publishing in regulatory governance. My name is Petra Mahy and I'm moderating this webinar this evening. This panel discussion has been organised as part of the GARNET virtual colloquium on regulatory governance, which is currently underway. GARNET stands for Governance and Regulation Research Network, and this is a network of academics and higher degree research students at the Centre for Global Business at Monash Business School. The panel has also been advertised more widely, so it's possible that we may have some additional participants from elsewhere around the world. We are meeting virtually, of course, but many of us may be located physically on the lands of First Nations peoples in Australia and elsewhere. In the spirit of reconciliation, our GARNET network acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. The aim of this evening's session is to explore opportunities, requirements and perhaps even the difficulties and solutions for academics, particularly PhD students and early career researchers who are seeking to publish their research on regulatory governance issues. To discuss this topic, we've invited 3 editors from journals that are either dedicated to the field of regulation or which often publish regulatory pieces. So please allow me to now introduce our 3 panelists. We have firstly Dr. Thomann from the University of Exeter, and she is one of the editors of the journal Regulation and Governance. So welcome, Eva. Secondly, we also have Professor Georg Ringe, and perhaps you could tell me if I've pronounced your name correctly, Georg?
That sounds perfect.
Thank you.
Almost perfect.
And he's from the University of Hamburg and is an editor of the Journal of Financial Regulation. And finally, a little closer to home, we also have Professor John Howe from the University of Melbourne, who is an editor of the Australian Journal of Labour Law. Thank you all very much for joining. Thank you. Thank you all very much for joining the panel and particularly being willing to speak to us after hours. So for Eva and Georg, it's still early morning there in Europe, and here it's already evening for John. So the plan for tonight's session is that I'll begin by posing some initial questions to our panelists, and then we'll invite additional questions from participants. So participants, if you would like to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A function, and please also indicate if you would like me to read out the question for you, or if you would like us to give you the mic and you can ask it in person. So I think a good place to start is by asking each of our panelists to briefly outline the scope of your respective journals, perhaps a little bit about its history, if you know its history. What is it that makes your journal distinctive? And perhaps we could start with you, Eva, with regulation and governance.
Thanks. Yeah, good evening, morning, everybody. So regulation and governance, as the name already says, is the major journal to publish about regulation and governance. We basically publish research addressing the world's most pressing audit and risk challenges. We very much have an international audience, and we also have a strong interdisciplinary focus. So our goal is to transcend intellectual and geographic boundaries, and we publish work by political scientists, by lawyers, economists, sociologists, historians, psychologists, and so on. We are a relatively young journal. I believe it's about 15 years. Don't name me down on it, but and the journal's history very much is connected with our main editor, David Levy-Faure, from Jerusalem, who has been pushing the journal We have 4 issues per year and about 9 to 10 articles per issue. And we've been doing really well. I've been checking the stats, and I've seen that we've actually, currently we are ranked 12 in political science, 8 in public administration, and 7 in law. So we're basically consistently in the top 10% of journals in political science and law, and in the top 20 in public administration. So I think this interdisciplinary focus has been a strong part of our success. We currently have 4 editors. So it's David Levy-Faure, who is also a political scientist. Then it's Sally Simpson from Maryland, who is a criminologist. We have Benjamin van Rooij from Amsterdam, who is a law scholar studying law implementation, and I am a political scientist at the intersection of, public administration, who also studies policy implementation. And we publish 3 main types of articles. The main format is, of course, the research article. We're interested in publishing empirical results as well. But we also publish review articles on major lines of research in the field. And sometimes we publish shorter essays exploring new insights and directions for study.
Okay, thank you, Eva. Perhaps we'll move now to Georg, and I guess moving from the more general regulation and governance to a more specific topic, which is financial regulation. Could you give us a sense of the scope of your journal as well, please?
Yes, a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm talking about the Journal of Financial Regulation, which is a child of the financial crisis that occurred. I mean, we tend to forget in the current COVID crisis, there was a big last crisis, which happened just about 12 years ago. And this was the intellectual starting point for a number of scholars that really tried to think about the implications of that crisis and the regulatory implications for banks and financial institutions. Also very much from an interdisciplinary perspective and also from a global perspective. So I would very much echo what Eva has just been saying. It's really an attempt to bring disciplines together, and also because financial markets are so global and these regulatory questions are really not just confined to one particular nation. It's completely an illusion to regulate a financial institution just with one nation state. We thought that there is a need and a gap for an outlet that addresses those questions of bringing together the entire world, essentially. And the journal grew out of conversations and research that we carried out. So it's a group of people who were originally all somehow affiliated with the University of Oxford. We've since then moved on, and we're now all in different places around the world, which reflects, I guess, a bit the different scope of the journal. So the current editors are Dan Ory, who's now at Cornell, and Kate Judge, who's at Columbia Law School, myself in Hamburg, and still teaching in Oxford as well, and then Geneviève Ringe, who's teaching in Paris, in Singapore, and also in Oxford. So we are really a global bunch, I guess, and we are very much interested in cutting edge research on this, reflecting, I should say, mostly research from law and also from economics, but also from sociology, from political science. So it's really a sort of very broad variety of things that we do publish.
Thank you. And we'll move to the third journal, which is a slightly different journal in terms of its scope. John, would you like to give us some background on the Australian Journal of Labour Law?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Petra. So the Australian Journal of Labour Law was established in the late 1980s. So it's it's been going for about 32 years now. And it's, our main focus is Australian labour law. But I think, I think the journal's always taken a fairly broad perspective to that scope. So we've always welcomed articles by non-lawyers, as long as they are broadly about labour regulation in Australia. And also I think labour law is a field which, it's very much a field where there's an acknowledgement that law is only one aspect of the regulation and the activity of labour relations. So I think there's always been a acknowledgement that that law is one piece of the puzzle. So yes, it's a journal where there has to be some connection with Australian labour regulation, but we've welcomed comparative pieces and pieces by non-lawyers and so on over the years. We publish 3 issues a year, and there are currently 3 editors of the journal. Me, obviously, being one of them, Shane McChrystal from Sydney University, and Andrew Stewart from the University of Adelaide. So that's the broad history of the journal. We also we publish probably 3 or 4 articles in each issue, and then we have a number of what are called sections. So there are sections of the journal for pieces on reports, so policy reports and so on, legislative developments, recent cases, book reviews, practice and procedure. The other thing that I'd say just in general about the journal is in the last 2 to 3 years we've now started to publish probably 1 special issue each year with guest editors. So that was something which happened occasionally in the past, but we seem to be now doing that annually, mostly by, I think mostly organically rather than as a policy decision. We've just started to have a lot more interest from people in putting together special issues, and so we've welcomed that development.
So John, I noticed you kind of slipped between law and regulation just now as you were describing the journal.
Yeah.
Does the journal ever publish papers that don't have any strictly doctrinal labour law in them, would you say?
Oh, look, yeah, we certainly publish papers which don't have doctrinal labour law. I mean, I think, as I say, because our field is one where there's a recognition that law as traditionally conceived is not the only sort of mechanism that's impacting on what happens in the sector. Unions, so you have trade unions and employer associations historically reaching, agreements about terms and conditions that were endorsed by a tribunal. So legislation actually played, for most of the 19th century, a fairly limited role in our system, and a lot of the terms and conditions of work were being determined by co-regulation between parties, the parties of the system, and non-state actors were an important part of even the formal system. I think also since the early 2000s, or since the late 1990s, regulation studies has been very influential in Australian labour law scholarship, in part for that reason, in part to try and, because it helped make sense of a lot of the non-traditional law that was happening. So I think so while we still publish a lot of traditional doctrinal labour law scholarship, we also publish, as I mentioned, non-legal scholarship, which might take a very broad approach to what is labour regulation in Australia, and also legal scholarship that takes a very broad, that takes a regulatory perspective and doesn't just see case law and legislated rules as the sources of labour law in Australia.
Do you have a sense, John, of whether your journal is typical or atypical in this respect, in having this regulatory content for a law journal?
Oh, look, yeah, for a law journal, I think we're probably relatively atypical. You know, in Australia, the main law reviews, the university, you know, law reviews run by students, while they've broadened a lot in their scope of what they publish, they're probably still fairly doctrinal. And so are some of the other, law reviews focused on particular fields. I'm not saying we're an outlier, but, I think, again, that the combination of the nature of our field and the strong influence of regulatory studies, Richard Johnston, is one of the, pioneers, I think, really, of the emergence of a coherent field of regulatory scholarship. And, he was part of the Centre for Employment and Labour Relations Law here at the University of Melbourne, where the journal was founded. So he and Richard Mitchell have very much took that very regulatory perspective on the field.
Thank you. We might move back to Eva and Georg. Still, I guess, on the issue of, scope of the journal, and thinking about what does regulation or governance actually mean, which is, very tricky concepts to try and pin down. They're used by scholars in very different ways. And I guess we could argue that your respective journals, play a role in defining what these terms actually mean through the choices that you make as editors as to what fits within the scope of your journals and what doesn't. So I wonder whether the two of you might say a little more about what's in scope and what might fall outside the scope of what you would see as being regulation and governance or financial regulation. Georg, perhaps we could start with you with the Journal of Financial Regulation. A big question.
Well, that's the million-dollar question. So what really is regulation? Well, I would say it's is any attempt of ordering how private actors behave on the market, right? So, I mean, the classic attempt of regulation is state-sponsored legislation in the traditional way, but as we know, there are many new innovative ways of going about this, up to the point where we have self-regulation by the private players. So any attempt of giving a structure to the behavior, I think, would fall under this. So we would understand it very broadly construed. And since we are an international journal, and since, as I've explained before, financial markets are so global that we lack any state power, right? There is no world government that can adopt any rules of the game for the world market. We are at a loss anyhow to use the traditional tools, right? So we are very innovative and very creative, I guess, in counting anything to fall under that scope. Now, I should say, what we do not publish is sort of pure, let's say, finance or economics research that is sort of just looking at market behavior, or just empirical research without any normative, without any policy implication, as I should say, right, which has sort of at least modest connection to regulatory issues. But apart from that, as I said, the connection to regulation in inverted commas can come from different perspectives. It can outline sort of the legal implication, the economic effects of regulation. It can research the political economy behind regulations. There are many angles of looking at that, and I think we are very open-minded about those issues.
And what about you, Eva, at regulation and governance?
Yes, it is the million-dollar question. Actually, the answer to this question is in an article that we've published in our journal in 2017 by Cobb and Martin Lodge. The title is "What is Regulation? An Interdisciplinary Concept Analysis." Seriously, it's a great article, so I recommend reading it. But more generally, the answer, I think, is it's a fascinating and interdisciplinary and a surprisingly multidimensional concept, regulation. And we generally distinguish three understandings of regulation. We have, regulation more classically as state intervention, which is usually binding, where the state regulates individual and collective behavior. But then we also have regulation as governance, where both individual and collective behavior and also market and state failures are regulated, and which involves state, but also state-like actors. And then finally, we have regulation much more broadly as mechanisms of social control, where also social and economic behavior is regulated, and where also non-state actors like business actors or civil society actors can actually act as regulators. And here regulation can also include something like the redistribution of resources or even soft norms, like reputation, for instance. And in our journal, we adopt all these understandings of regulation, so we invite submissions on all of them, including also on the third understanding, the broad understanding as regulation as mechanisms of social control. So there are a few killer criteria. The first one is the paper shouldn't be too discipline specific. So similarly to what Georg just said, the paper has to address the interdisciplinary audience and speak to those concepts and theories of regulation and governance theory. So we often desk reject papers just by saying it would be better suited for a discipline specific journal. A second killer criterion is if it's too focused on a case or some cases, but doesn't really make this linkage to the overarching concepts and theories of regulation. So I have found myself, we often publish papers about the European Union, for instance, but we have also desk rejected European Union papers because they just kind of take the EU and just talk about the EU, but don't really make this, broader link for scholars that are not just spending their lives studying the EU, right? And then another thing, but I guess here, because we are an interdisciplinary journal, probably not all the editors feel as strongly about this as I do, but often it's like, oh, this is yet another essay, opinion piece. We do publish essays, but they have to be really good, and they have to be really of a high significance to the field. So if the paper just lacks really a clear theoretical contribution or an empirical contribution, a methodology and so on, this could be a reason to reject it. Yes, that's it.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's really interesting to get that insight into sort of what falls within scope and what potentially may fall without. And I guess if we take what you just said, Eva, it seems like it's that connection with theory and the dialogues that are happening within regulatory governance disciplines. And I guess just following on from that, I wonder whether there are any particular hot topics or dialogues that are currently playing out in your respective journals, and whether that's a hint as to what editors are looking for at the moment. Georg, should we go back to you on that one?
Yeah, what are the hot topics? Well, number one hot topic, of course, is COVID at the moment, and the regulatory implications from COVID. That's maybe something so broad that it rather fits more into regulation governance. But of course, the financial market and the banking institutions are or will be affected by this dramatically as well, and regulators are already busy anticipating all of those. So there is a big chunk of research down that line. Then probably a bit more long-term is sustainability in financial regulation. That's a very hot topic, which encompasses green finance, for example, but other things. And then two other things which are maybe a little bit less dramatic at the moment. The number one thing for the last several years was Brexit in financial markets, a very important thing. And then the global financial crisis from 2008 was the big event over the last decade, let's say. So those were the big things, I would say, that kept us busy. I should say, however, because there are many people in the audience who think maybe about submitting or think, is this something that I need to write? Don't design your research in a way that you have to tick those fields, right? I mean, it can be a strategy to actually go against the tide and say, the journals receive so many things about, and I know how many articles we receive about COVID at the moment, right? And it can be quite clever, to go against the mainstream and pick something really innovative, which is completely out of context, and then you have a standalone criterion. So I would, I wouldn't necessarily design my research only to be in those big four fields. Maybe that's something that my panel colleagues here can confirm.
Yeah, well, jumping on the COVID bandwagon does seem to be something that many academics are doing at the moment. Is that coming through in the Australian Journal of Labour Law, John? Is those sorts of topics playing out there as well?
Yes, they are. We have actually got a special issue, which will be the first issue of the journal next year, on COVID-19 and labour regulation in Australia. But I'd imagine beyond the special issue, a lot of scholarship on the impacts of COVID-19. We've just had some changes to legislation proposed by the government, which ostensibly, in response to the pandemic, but I think a lot of them are just, politically motivated. So, yeah, I imagine we'll see quite a bit of material about things like, change in working practices. So with all the increase in remote working at home, you've got the increase in platform work, people relying on, delivery drivers and things like that. And, availability of leave and so on to deal with, and work health safety issues to deal with frontline workers. So I think we're going to see a lot of that. I mean, I think just looking beyond the pandemic, what we have been seeing in labour law is also a lot of empirical research, a lot more. So people who are looking at, how the regulatory system is operating on the ground rather than just looking at the rules. And that, that can be research that's looked at very much through a regulatory lens. So I'd say that's been another trend in what we've been seeing.
And Eva, at Regulation and Governance, what are the hot topics coming through for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. We haven't actually gotten as many COVID papers as I would have thought. And I think it's also because a lot of journals have been really quick to kind of invite, specifically invite submissions on this topic and make do things like fast track review for these. And we have discussed this, and our approach was that we said, yes, of course it is important, and yes, we invite these papers, but we still need to have, proper quality control and proper peer review and all that. I mean, good research usually takes a bit of time. So we are getting them, but yeah, not as many as I would have thought. Other than that, a really hot topic right now is algorithmic regulation, everything that has to do with new technologies, big data, privacy, things like this. So, and then another important topic, and I think it relates to a question that has been asked in the Q&A. We really, we are trying to publish more papers that study the global South. We are very keen to do this. We are aware that a lot of, the existing concepts and theories of regulation and governance are built on a body of knowledge that has focused on specific regions of the world. And We believe that this is, in a sense, a skewed approach at the moment to the production of knowledge. So we are trying to change that. And another topic is corruption, good governance, things like this. And then, of course, we have the evergreens. Implementation is also a big one for us. Things like agencyfication, legitimacy, and accountability, risk regulation, multinationals, private hybrid regulation, lobbying, standard setting. But I completely agree with Georg that I would definitely invite especially young scholars to break new grounds and innovative grounds and surprise us. As editors, you get to see so many manuscripts, and you get to see the same manuscripts on the same topics, or seemingly the same manuscripts all over again. So it's really nice for us to also see new stuff and new important topics.
Perhaps I could just ask a little more about publishing on the Global South, given that there is a question here specifically about Tunisia, but I guess we're talking more generally about developing country contexts. And I guess there's an inherent obstacle for scholars from those parts of the world in terms of publishing in English, submitting to world-leading journals. Are there any ways that your journals try to particularly solicit or ask for or support papers that are written by scholars from the Global South?
Are you still asking me?
Eva, yes, I think so.
Well, I mean, it's difficult for us to, in general, to attract a specific kind of authorship. In the sense, I mean, we have statistics about where scholars submit from, and what we do is, we do not like it. We just try to send stuff out for review if we think it's interesting and important. And as I said, one of the important topics that we see is publishing research on the Global South. But one obstacle that I see there is often that such papers tend to be very focused on the case. And I mentioned earlier that this can be a killer criterion. So one thing we might do, I have found myself doing, is just get back to authors and tell them, look, can you just try and flesh out the relevance for regulation and governance a bit more and resubmit, for instance. And another thing that we have recently adopted is a free format policy. So I believe this can be beneficial in the sense that the hurdles for submitting a paper, preparing the paper for submission to specific journals are lower. So we don't require a specific formatting as long as it's legible and, readable, basically. But other than that, we don't have specific policies to attract scholars from Global South. I mean, we try to reach out to them through webinars like this, for instance, but I'm very open for suggestions here, actually, how that could look like.
Thank you, Eva. What about you, Georg? Is that...
Just because just very briefly. So I have the stats here, submitting country of submission. So one of our major countries of submission is actually China. So it's among the top four. We also get relatively many from Hong Kong, Brazil, India, South Korea. So in terms of submissions, it's quite nice. And then when we look at the accepted papers, in 2018, 18% of the papers were from Asia, 0 from Africa, also 0 from Latin America. So we could still probably do better there. But for this, we need scholars. Obviously, we need them to submit, That's it, sorry.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting. Georg, does that come through for you as well at the Journal of Financial Regulation? Is that an issue that you as editors have to deal with?
Sounds all pretty familiar as a problem, right? Of course, we also do our best to represent scholarship from all over the world, and I think we're not bad at doing this, but I will not deny that, the first first starting point, the first condition for a publication is a good quality English, and that's where many things already have difficulties with that come through. Of course, we try to abstract from that, and we try to even put things through peer review, even if the language and all of this could still be improved if there's really quality that comes through. But I will not deny, we're all just human beings, and that sort of is an essential thing. I think that's something that the authors will have to address themselves. Or we're not a language assistant, right, for them. So that's definitely something that needs to be tackled. And then yes, we do look at research from all over the world, but as Eva said, not undeniably the status quo is that we are heavily focused. I don't have the statistics here with me, but sort of it's a similar story, right? The most research that we publish does come from the usual suspects, focused on North America, Europe, Asia increasingly. But there are certain parts of the world that are underrepresented. That's true. And we do take that seriously, and we do try to find ways of addressing it, down to marketing efforts and trying to engage with scholars and all of this. But as Eva said, it depends in the first place from a stream of submissions coming from those parts of the world, and that is sometimes difficult to get off the ground.
John, I imagine that this issue is not quite as strong for you given the jurisdictional nature of your journal, but perhaps you might comment on the question.
Sure. No, that's right. I mean, we do receive quite a few submissions particularly from India, but because of our scope as being wanting at least some consideration of the Australian, system of labour regulation or labour regulation in Australia, we don't get many which are endeavouring to do that. So, and so that's a challenge because because of our our requirement. As to how but basically what we try to encourage is comparison. So we're quite happy to publish comparative papers, and I think would be quite happy to publish papers that are not necessarily, 50-50 about Australia and another country, as long as there's some engagement with our regulatory environment in some way. But we don't. The truth is we don't get many of those papers or people that are willing to do that. I think the other challenge for us is, I think ideally it'd be great if we could publish more material, more articles looking at Australia in the region and comparisons with other systems in the region. So it's an interesting challenge to think about how to do that. One of the obstacles we do face is the publisher of the Australian Journal of Labour Law, LexisNexis, is a very traditional legal publisher focused on the Australian market, for the journal, which it sees as mostly law firms in Australia and universities. So and other sort of organisations in Australia. So that's another challenge we have to address. So in other words, they don't give us a lot of push out into those other areas. So it's something that the editors would definitely have to lead through our scholarly networks. But I think it's probably something it is something we should have a look at and think about, because I really would welcome more diversity in our scholarship, as long as we still meet that requirement of it having consideration or relevance to the Australian system in some way.
Thank you. Eva, if I may, it sounds like you've got some interesting broader statistics there about your journal. I wonder if you can tell us how many papers are submitted on average per year, and then what's the sort of, approval, acceptance and rejection rates from that.
I don't know about
like yours.
just before I start, because I just wanted to add one more point to the last discussion, which I think is important. Another thing that we at least try to do is to, make sure that we engage the diversity of reviewers into the review process. So we try to, because this is about the production of knowledge. And so we try to engage, make sure that we have people from different institutions, from different regions of the world, also gender-wise. And I think, this is probably something that takes longer. But I think in the longer term, this is going to pay off. We are also trying to diversify our editorial board and so on. Okay, so stats. All right. So we receive about 300 new manuscripts per year. So that's quite a lot. And about 2/3 of these are new submissions and the others are revised manuscripts. And this is going up each year. The acceptance rate is about 20%, and it's obviously going down because we still only have 4 issues, with about 9 to 10 papers per issue per year. We desk reject about 60% of the manuscripts. So these usually get rejected within, let me check, desk reject. So the average number, the median number of days to from submission to first decision is 46, but the desk rejects are usually within 2 weeks or so. So I believe that this is actually good news for early career researchers, because it means that they can move on. So I know that, especially early career researchers tend to be really frustrated when the article is desk rejected. But I would encourage you to look at this in a more positive way, because you're not wasting time. And basically what it means is, there might be a better journal for your article where it has better chances of getting published. And so look at it in a positive way. You're not wasting time. You can move on. Yeah, okay. So what else? The quantity and speed of review, we have, in 2019, we have sent almost 1,500 review invitations, and only about half as many reviews completed, about 740. And it takes reviewers about 30 days to review, to complete their review. So that's the median number of days. So that's actually quite fast. And we are also trying to encourage them to be fast. Most of the articles that are submitted to our journal are regular research articles. And then there are some reviews, and then a small, very small, maybe that's about, I don't know, that's probably about 3%. So really the big bulk are regular research articles. Yeah, I think I've mentioned, I believe I probably have mentioned the most important stats, or did I forget anything important, relevant?
I think that sounded like a good broad sweep of your statistics. Thank you.
So, I mean, overall, what I can say is that we do our best as editors. The way this is organized is that the papers are first screened for formal stuff, and if they meet the submission requirements, then they go to David Levy-Faux, and David allocates them to us according to topics. So we're 4 editors, as I said, and so he makes sure that we get papers that are more or less in our area of expertise, and then we invite reviewers. And so obviously it all takes time. It takes me maybe it takes me 4 days until I have time to take care of the manuscript. And then what often happens is that reviewers actually take a really long time to respond to review requests, or they don't respond, or they, it can be really hard to find good reviewers. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that you don't see as an author. But we are really trying to do our best to you know, have the review processes as speedy as possible, also because we know it is a major factor for our success in the end. Authors submit to journals where they don't have to wait a year until they get the first review.
Absolutely. Are the processes and statistics relatively similar for you, Georg, at the Journal of Financial Regulation?
Yes, thank you. It's actually interestingly similar, yes. So we also have 4 editors, and what we do is we alternate responsibility for each new issue, right? So the next one will be put together by X, and then the next one will be put together by Y, and so alternate responsibilities. And so that person screens all the incoming submissions. We're obviously a smaller journal than Regulation Governance, so we have about 80 submissions per year, and that managing editor for the issue then distributes, similar as you said, responsibility for each article, and it will be then decided how many will be desk rejected, and the other ones will be sent out for peer review, which takes a while. Yes, our acceptance rate is actually rather similar. So I've just checked it, 18.6% is our acceptance rate, which is similar to the 20% that we've just heard. So it's about the same thing. We should say we only have 2 issues per year, right? So we're smaller, about half the number of regulation governance. But I would very much support what Eva said about the desk reject. I think it's a helpful exercise not to, you know, to overburden our reviewers, because the reviewers will be a bit, you know, taken aback when they get tons of submissions every day. And then at the same time, it allows the authors to, you know, take this as a quick signal. We usually drop them a few lines of why it doesn't fit to the scope of the journal. We sometimes even propose alternative journals that might be a better fit. And so that's, I think, a helpful service for authors to then move on and to consider other options. So all in all, I think we have built, and we're still a quite young journal, right? So we're still in the building up phase. We might expand and increase the number of issues later down the road. But then again, we are rather specialized in the subject matter, so we feel comfortable with a smaller number of high quality scholarships, so rather quality rather than quantity. And that's particularly important when you want to establish a new journal, right? So we've been around for 5 years, and so that's still in the building up phase, I guess, where you need to make a name in the field. So all in all, I think we're pretty happy with how it goes from our side, and we get some very good feedback from the authors as well. We're very happy with this sort of process. OUP is obviously a great publishing house with a good sort of back apparatus and marketing and taking the stuff to conferences and using social media. So all of this sort of comes as a package and helps us in our way, I think, to build a forum, a sort of institutionalized dialogue platform for research rather than just a journal. And we do a conference every year. So lots of things going on together with the journal, which I think makes this a very good place to publish.
As someone who's been on the receiving end of desk rejections that had no explanation or advice, it's really nice to hear, I think, that that editors are taking the time to help us pour submitters out. So thank you for that.
You know, you can also ask. I mean, I don't always give a justification, but if you really want to know, just write an email back and ask. It's, you know, it won't hurt.
John, if I could move to you just on the issue of submissions and statistics, what's it like at your journal?
Well, I'm feeling like we're a bit of a minnow, really, in the international pool of journals. So we get about 25 submissions a year, and our acceptance rates vary, but 40 to 50%, depending on the year. So So we don't, because of the limits of our scope, to the Australian jurisdiction and to labour law, even though we see that very broadly, it's not a huge pool of potential. Another good reason to reach out to the region. Yeah.
Sounds like it, absolutely. I might just now move to some of the questions that are coming through the Q&A. We have one here and I'll just read it out for you. They're asking, in terms of novelty, could the speakers please share their views and expectations from submitted papers before deciding to publish them? So I guess that's on how unusual the paper is, I think the question is. And also, how would they treat sensitive issues emerging from investigative research, such as corruption, conflict of interest, or non-mainstream issues that could impinge on a country's or a group within them, a country's national stability? So I think there's two questions here. One is about the novelty factor, and the second is the sensitivity of a particular issue. I'm not sure who I should go to for this, so I might just leave that open. Who would like to jump in?
Yeah, well, about the novelty, it's it's a double-edged sword. Of course, it's great to have a novel, an original argument and a finding, and that is definitely something we encourage and we're looking for. At the same time, knowledge is also cumulative, right? And so sometimes it's important to that many scholars, do research on the same topic, that test the same argument in different ways. I'm also personally a great believer in replication. I believe more replication studies should be done, just to see if we can corroborate findings from other scholars and so on. So I would say novelty is not a necessary condition. It can be a sufficient condition if it's a great piece of work. Yeah, but I think it can be overrated. It can lead, people to not do enough research on topics that are less novel, sexy, if you will. So what has to be there is a contribution. And, also talking about, what it would be a key advice that I would give everyone would be like, try and summarize your key contribution in 3 sentences. Convince me. Make me interested, like make me listen to you. And I think you have to be able to do that. So you have to think about what is your contribution to the field, also keeping in mind the focus of the journal you're submitting to and the kind of audience that it speaks to.
Yeah, I would put it in the following way. Novelty as such is not an end in itself, right? It's not anything that is sort of prerequisite for us to publish it. At the same time, I expect some novel angle, something. I mean, there has to be something new in an article, because if it's just a repetition of what's been there all the time, then we're not going to look at it. So it's a fine line, I think, for authors to tread on and to make clear from the beginning, look, this is the new perspective here of this piece. This is the new argument that I'm putting to the case. These are new data that I have. This is a new point of view in a long-going debate. Or in the extreme, this is a completely new research field that I'm pioneering. But so there has to be a new flavor, right? But again, I wouldn't encourage those in the audience who think about submitting to just go into something novel just in order to be, just to increase the chances of submitting, right? So do stick to your experiences, do stick to your expertise, and within that framework, yes, the article should be somehow novel, right? If that makes sense. So it's somehow ambiguous concept, I would imagine.
Look, I agree with George that we're always looking for novelty or originality. But we also needs to be we're looking at the quality of the paper. So, you know, we want to have original pieces that contribute something to the field, and you know, the more interesting they are, the better. But they've still got to be well argued, well structured. You know, the analysis has to be coherent and supported by evidence, etc. So, you know, that's all taken into account. I've seen papers which, you know, which we've encouraged people to revise and resubmit because they're novel and really original, but they haven't pulled it off. You know, so you've still got to be able to pull it off. On the second question, I mean, we probably not so much directed at me, but you know, you might have pieces on controversial topics, and generally we'll publish them, and as long as they meet our scholarly criteria, and our referees support them being published. But we don't, you know, I couldn't think of an example where, you know, because we're so focused on Australia, I suppose there might be examples where you might have something which is a comparison with, say, China, and you know, that might raise some of those issues, but we generally haven't had that problem.
And you, Eva, are there any topics that are off limits because of sensitivity?
I am not aware of that. I guess actually quite to the contrary. I mean, I believe, you know, sensitivity can mean that it's important. I mean, it's difficult to talk about it in this abstract sense, but I totally side with John here. You know, if it's good work, we publish it. And if the authors have any concerns, for example, regarding, you know, anonymity, or, you know, publishing data that is sensitive, then they should really reach out to us so we can find a solution, right? I mean, we generally encourage transparency when it comes to data. Like, you know, there have been all these developments, you know, we all adhere to the COPE guidelines, and there has been this DART initiative, which tries to make scholars publish all their raw data. And I mean, we are very aware that this can be a sensitive issue for, you know, more qualitative research where, you know, there are issues of confidentiality and so on. And so if authors have any concerns in this regard, they should reach out to us. But I would very much encourage, I mean, don't refrain from submitting your paper to a journal because you believe it's too sensitive. We are a scholarly journal, we are not a political journal.
And just making my way through some of the other questions here. We have one here about if there's a preference for either quantitative or qualitative analysis in the empirical papers that you publish. And this is particularly for you, Eva, but perhaps our other editors may have a view as well. So qualitative versus quantitative?
No preference. We pride ourselves of our inclusivity. It has to be well done. You know, it has to conform to the highest standard for empirical research. These standards differ between qualitative and quantitative methods, and we have a really great set of really skilled, specialized reviewers for any method.
What about you, Georg? Does the Journal of Financial Regulation have a slant in either direction?
So, same as Eva, right? So we are also quite open to methodology and no preference. No, it's the substance that counts and not the method. So no preference.
John, anything on that from you?
Preference for research that is not just data driven. So whether it's quantitative or qualitative, you know, it shouldn't just be driven by the case or by the data set. There should be, as Georg said, there should be good substance. Okay, sorry.
That's okay. I agree, Eva. That's what I was going to say. We don't have a preference for the methodology, but we certainly, you know, need to see that methodology is being analysed and presented in a way that relates to our, you know, our scope and is of a quality that's publishable by the journal.
Okay, another question here. The question is that sometimes an issue might be novel in a particular jurisdiction, but it's already been dealt with in another jurisdiction. What are your views on this, especially where legal solutions could not be easily transplanted to another jurisdiction? So, question about novelty again, but jurisdiction-based.
Maybe I can say something on this. So this is sometimes an issue when you receive submissions that are simply, I mean, I'm really a bit exaggerating it now, but copy pasting something that's been done in, let's say, jurisdiction A into jurisdiction B and making the same argument. And that's not really novel in a sense. So, you know, it may be interesting to go beyond this and say, look, solution so-and-so has worked, has really improved, in our case, for example, financial stability in jurisdiction 1, you know, how would the same tool of regulating financial institution work in jurisdiction B, right? So for example, how would an American approach to bank resolution, for example, work in Europe? Are there the same expectations that we hope to have seen in jurisdiction 1? And what is the political context? What's the economic context? What is the legal framework? How would it fit in? So if there is sort of additional going beyond the mere taking it into another context and saying everything I've always wanted to say about jurisdiction 2, then so if there is this extra effort of really making the comparative dimensional effort of exploring the context, then I think that's interesting work, right? But just this taking the idea that we've already had and moving it into country so-and-so is in many situations, unfortunately, not enough, right? And you get this frequently from somebody who, let's say, comes from a particular country, and then all they do is to take an article that's already been there and motivate the same idea again, right? And that's something that's not really worthwhile reading, in my view. So we really ask for some more effort in that context.
Eva, would you like to add anything on this question?
Well, I mean, in a way, I agree with Georg. No, I agree with Georg, but I also think, I mean, it can be viable to do this, but it goes back to this advice that I gave earlier. You have to think about, why is this important, and what can we learn from it? You know, what does it add to what we already know? This is what matters. So it can completely make sense to take a question studied in one context and study it in a different context. But then what in the end makes for a good article is that you tell the reader, you tell the research community how this adds to our existing body of knowledge. And this is where it has to be interesting, it has to be relevant.
Yeah, look, I've seen some really excellent articles which, you know, look at what you might describe as a novel idea in one jurisdiction, and then, you know, look at that issue or phenomenon in another. But it's just how you do it, right? It's and if it is, say, a regulatory approach that might have worked in one country, you know, has the author considered, you know, the relevant, you know, sort of principles of comparative law or whatever it might be, of looking at the different cultural, economic, social, political context of the other country, in order to make their argument. So as long as it's a high quality analysis of whether something that's been considered in another country, you know, let's say it's someone who's doing that looking at Australia, then, you know, if the referees agree that it's a strong piece, then we'll publish it. But, you know, you see good and bad examples of people doing that.
Thank you. Eva, we have a question specifically for you, I think. You were saying earlier that a paper might be rejected if it was only a methodology paper or only an essay. Could you elaborate a little more on this and perhaps provide some pointers on what an editor would expect to see in a paper that would warrant publication? So perhaps what would make it, I think you mentioned a really brilliant essay might be published in Regulation and Governance, but can you explain a little more about what that might look like?
You know, we are mainly interested in publishing research. So there is, to me, there is a difference between research and opinion. And when you have essays, this line is often blurred, right? And so what we get a lot of essays, and what we are looking for in essays is that there is an analytic contribution based on, you know, some clearly recognizable body of theory or of, you know, of empirical material, not just an opinion. You know, it has to be relevant. And, you know, I mean, just consider that we reject 80% of the articles that we get, you know. And so whatever your article is, whether it's a research piece, you know, empirical research, or whether it's an essay, or whether it's a review, you have to think about, how do I make it into these 20%? And it goes back to the advice that I gave, you know, think about, how would I explain to the editors the importance, relevance, and key lesson of this piece in 3 sentences? And then you put these 3 sentences in the letter to the editors, you know. Does that make sense?
I think it does, yes, thank you.
In terms of good examples, we have actually the most cited papers of our journal are on our website. I think we have a section, and so just look at these, they're great.
We have a more practical question coming through here as well. Should I submit my paper online through your website Manuscript submissions, or can I send it directly to a main editor? What's your policy on this particular procedure, I guess, a procedural question? Georg?
Yeah, so the answer is quite clear. We do have an online submission facility on our website, and we do encourage everybody to use that. That makes life dramatically easier for the editors. All of that said, what we do offer is some pre-submission advice, right? So I frequently get emails with somebody asking, would that be interesting for the journal in the first place? And that's sort of some even preliminary step before the official submission. So that's something that we do welcome. But at some point later on, the manuscript has to go through our online facility. Yeah, but that's not very difficult, not very demanding. It's actually just a tool to facilitate life for the editors.
So you receive quite a number of these sort of pre-submission queries, would you say?
Not a high number. No, I mean, most people know whether the manuscript is somehow suitable for the journal. It's more about those borderline manuscripts that are somehow on the subject matter somewhere between financial regulation and then, let's say, more broader, like capital markets, for example. So those things which are a little bit in the gray zone, then they sometimes come and ask whether this would be of interest.
What about you, John? Is it, do you get a lot of personal submissions coming to you as an editor of the Australian Journal of Labour Law?
I'd just love to have a manuscript submission system. I've been lobbying for that with our publisher to move into the 21st century since I became an editor 5 years ago, but I haven't got very far. Yeah, look, I'd just echo Jörg's comments that we do get people sometimes contacting us to see whether, you know, an article is, you know, within our scope or seems like something we might publish, but most people go through the the journal email address that, you know, sort of what the main avenue we expect people to submit through. You know, some people will copy us in, which was fine, you know. And I'm also happy to answer queries about papers and whether there's something the journal might consider, particularly if, you know, they are something that might be, say, predominantly about another country, or, you know, one of those ones that doesn't have a lot of traditional law in it. And we're happy to give people advice about whether they're within scope.
Eva?
Yes, I mean, generally, I always recommend to, first thing, if you consider submitting a piece to a journal, go on the journal website and look at the section, you know, advice for authors, and a lot of your questions are going to be answered there. So most journals nowadays have this submission system, and you're not necessarily doing yourself a favor when you ignore that and just send the editors your manuscript anyway. We also offer advice, informal advice, but again, I would really be careful there. Don't ask the editors, would you reject this if I submitted it? I mean, it has happened to me, and don't do that, because that's what the submission portal is for. And if we do that, you will get a desk rejection within a matter of a few days, you know. So, but what you can do is you can ask, well, you know, you could just copy paste your abstract, for instance, and say, I'm not sure if this is a topic that falls within the scope of your journal. Or how would I have to frame this to make it interesting for your journal? Something like this. And we are very happy, of course, to answer this kind of email, especially if you try to make it concise and with a clearly formulated question.
Thank you. That sounds like really practical, useful hints there. We have a question from Meredith, and I think she wants to ask it live. So please go ahead, Meredith.
Thank you. And part of the reason for that is because I seem not to be able to actually ask questions in the Q&A in a webinar, a little odd quirk of webinars. But my question is slightly different from the ones we've seen. And it's a question for all three of you. I'm wondering how you ended up as editors of your particular journals, what path took you there, and sort of what benefits you get from being an editor, what you enjoy about it, and maybe if you could reflect a little bit on that role itself and what it's meant for you and how you've gotten there, and perhaps how you would advise an early career researcher who's thinking about potentially taking on a role at some point of being an editor, what advice you might give.
Who would like to go first on that one?
Don't do it for the money. Look, I might just go first as the smallest and most parochial of the journals. Look, I think it's a really rewarding role, because you see the breadth of scholarship in the field, and like both Eva and Jorg have said, we do try to give feedback to papers we reject, because particularly where we see potential or it's a original or important topic, even where it hasn't met our standards, we encourage people to further develop the paper and give them some feedback on what we think needs to be addressed for that reason. So look, I think a really rewarding role. As to, it's certainly quite labour intensive, particularly when you don't have a manuscript submission system, even though we're a small journal. So you need to be prepared to, and if you want your journal to be a quality journal, as I'm sure Eva and Jorg will attest, you do need to put in the effort to, to read and reread papers and proofs, even after they've been recommended for publication by referees and edited perhaps by student editors or the publisher. You've still got to check and recheck. As to how I became the editor, it's generally the journal has an editorial committee of leading scholars and practitioners in the field, and generally the editors, make some recommendations when there's, someone stepping down and there's some change process. The editors will identify, potential new editors and vet those with our editorial committee.
Eva, would you mind going next?
Yeah, I was approached about a year and a half. David Levy-Faux asked me, they were looking for an editor. I don't know why. No, I think, what is the journal looking for in an editor? I think that's the question, right? I think they're looking for scholars that, on the one hand, do the kind of research that resonates with the journal. They often look for scholars that have already published in the journal, for instance. And they look for people who are really well connected. And I think they do that because as an editor, you need to find reviewers. There's like a really diverse set of papers on different topics, and the one job of the editor is to figure out who would be a good reviewer for this piece, and to actually reach out to them and make them actually review this paper. And so it helps if you're a scholar who moves in different communities and has a good network, and it actually helps if people for some reason want to do you the favor of deliver the peer review. And then the other thing is, think about, as an editor, you need to have high standards of integrity and professionalism, which come with sometimes handling sensitive processes and handling some people are rude and stuff, so you need to stay professional. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen. So I think this is a certain set of skills that journals are looking for, and some people are good for that and others aren't. In my case, I had already edited a couple of special issues before, and I think that's how they kind of became interested. What would be my advice? Well, two pieces of advice. The first one is probably, wait until you're being asked. Sometimes some journals call for applications. In this case, apply. But just wait for the right opportunity. And I think that goes into the second advice, which is, there will be this stage in your career when you're really asked to do a lot of things. And not all of these are really great opportunities, because in every academic project, be it a journal or something else or a network, somebody has to do the work. And if you decide to volunteer, and just make no mistakes, we volunteer, we get a small honorarium, but it's not a lot. It has to be worth it. And sometimes it can be worth it saying no and waiting for a better journal, to ask you. And if you're not asked, don't be disappointed. It's a lot of work. I also, like John and Georg, I find it really rewarding. I think the major thing for me is that I learned so much. I learned so much from the manuscripts that I read, from the reviews, that I read. I learned about just new things, but also just about, what's going on in the field and in other fields, and what people think is relevant. And so that is just priceless. So it really helps me grow as a scholar. And I find it really rewarding to try and figure out, to find like good reviewers for a manuscript. I like connecting ideas and people, and so it's a nice challenge to think about. Okay, so this, who would be a good reviewer? I remember that person from that conference. So I read this paper, this is an important perspective. So I kind of like that. Also, as an author myself, I know how valuable it is when editors make the effort to find good reviewers, and you have speedy and you know, professional review processes. And I just enjoy facilitating this myself. And then a final point is a bit about agenda setting. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I mean, obviously, as editors, we have, in a way, the power, if you will, to kind of, you know, decide what we think is interesting and deserves being sent out to review. We're not abusing this power, but it is in a way attractive to you know, engage with what I find interesting and yeah, push things also a bit this way.
Thank you very much, Eva. That's really interesting and useful to know. Georg, are you motivated by the same issues as Eva and John?
Yes and no. So I would add another dimension, which is I was involved in setting up this new journal, right? So that's another way of not being asked or applying, but just create your own journal. And in my case, it was the situation that actually, you know, as I explained earlier, we were a group of scholars, and the field of financial regulation was growing so much after the last financial crisis that there was a need for a good quality journal. And we identified that there is a gap in the current offerings. I mean, there were lots of, let's say, practitioner-oriented journals around, and there were journals of sort of more business regulation, sort of more or regulation governance, sort of the broader ones, but there was no specific subject. And there were journals that were specific for individual jurisdictions, right? But there wasn't a global journal on this field. And so we thought, you know, we need something for our own work, actually, you know, which is now quite ironic because we have the strict policy that we, the editors, never publish in our own journal, right? So I still haven't found the perfect outlet for my for my work, being the editor now. But so we started this journal, let's say about 10 years ago, and it's a lot of work. I mean, even John, even with the submission platform, it's a lot of work, and it's even more work to get something like this off the ground, because you have to convince. I mean, just as a feeling, Oxford University Press, they do their own peer review process before they set up a new journal, right? So I think they send it to 12 reviewers to give their opinion on this new journal, because of course for them it's a big financial commitment to put up a new journal, and it's inevitably loss making the first years until sort of the financial rewards sets in the long run. So they need to be sure it's a good project. And so it took a lot of work to work with them to establish this, to build up a network, an editorial board, and all of those different things. Now looking back, the work that we put into this, I would have to think again, you know, if I do anything like this again. But of course, I would echo what the other two have said. It's extremely rewarding and a wonderful forum, as I said earlier. It's not just the journal as such, but we try to make it a point of discussion, a sort of conference that we organize, and newsletters do we send out, social media, and it's sort of like a common meeting point for scholars in the field, which is fascinating to see as an editor, to have this little baby growing and becoming a focal point in the scholarly debate, and that's extremely gratifying. So I have no regrets. In fact, I think it was a wonderful, and it is a wonderful project, which I'm very proud of.
Well, that sounds like a really positive note, perhaps, for us to wind this session up on. There are a couple of remaining questions there, but they look quite specific. So perhaps I might suggest that those askers send those questions directly I think they're to you, Georg, about scope of a particular paper for your journal. That sounds like a pre-submission email that might happen. But I guess this just leaves me to say a very warm thank you to our three panelists, to Eva, Georg, and John, for your generosity in speaking to this panel, particularly in the different time zones that we find ourselves in. And I think journal editors often seem to be quite mysterious and remote, and I guess gatekeepers to the success or failure of the rest of us. So thank you very much for demystifying your roles for us and providing useful insights to your respective journals and the sort of expectations of quality and novelty that you covered this evening. So thank you very much for that. And for those of you in the GARNET Colloquium, we will look forward to seeing you again tomorrow to continue our discussions on Zoom. But thank you very much to everyone, and I will close out the webinar just as soon as I find the right button to do it on. But
Thanks, Petra. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.